Hey everyone, welcome back to RetroBreak and welcome to yet another Game Boy Homebrew review. This week we're checking out Flying Arrows made by Studio Loading. And there is actually a sequel on the way for this game as well. So if you like what you see in this video, then check the link down in the description below to check out the Kickstarter that's running right now. And with that said, let's check out Flying Arrows and see what it's all about. Here we go. So before we check out the game itself, let's take a look at the box and the packaging. As you can see, the quality of the print is fantastic, and it's really nice cardboard too. Definitely one of the best homebrew boxes that I've showed off on the channel so far. As you can see on the back there's a range of different screenshots from the game. I did notice that the screenshot for the Super Game Boy must be an older version of the game because it doesn't show the custom borders, which you can actually see in my footage from the game a bit later on. It also shows a bit of the story on the back there as well. Unfortunately, the text is quite badly written and some of it doesn't really make that much sense. And inside, of course, we have the instruction manual and the game cartridge itself. Surprisingly, the instruction manual is only in black and white. I'm quite used to these homebrew games having full colour instruction manuals, but I guess it doesn't really matter that much, and the layout of the manual is very nice in fact. I also love all of the descriptions for the characters there, and there's some portraits for the bosses too, and a few little tips and tricks, and it's actually translated into several different languages as well. And now for the game cartridge, and there's a really nice attention to detail here. The cartridge actually follows Nintendo's official guidelines, sporting a black cart, which means that it's compatible with both the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. And if you noticed on the front of the box here, this logo also means that it's compatible with the Super Game Boy as well. And that's it for the unboxing. I'm sure you can tell it's very high quality and I was very pleased with it. And now let's check out what the game itself is all about. So the game begins with this opening cutscene told through this scroll which explains some of the controls and the objectives for the game. The actual plot though is a little bit harder to decipher thanks to some awkward translation issues. A stalagmite neck. Not sure what that means. After the title screen, which has some fantastic music by the way, first thing you're greeted with is this map screen. I love games that give a bit of context as to the location of the environments, so having this map was a really nice surprise. As you can see, there's 8 separate levels, each with their own boss fights and unique themes. After playing the first level, I expected the rest of the game to be quite open-ended and require some exploration, but I was surprised to find out that they were all actually quite linear, with just a few hidden areas scattered throughout. The core mechanic, as the title suggests, is the bow and arrow, which can be used to kill enemies and traverse the environment. The first level shows this off very well, with multiple areas to use the arrows as platforms by firing it at a certain part of the environment where it will then bounce around and you can try and time your jump to get on there at just the right time to be able to carry you across the level. It's such a cool mechanic. Unfortunately though, it is kind of underutilized in some of the later stages, with only a small handful of locations where you could actually use them to fly around the stage. When it is used though, it is a really fun and unique mechanic. I haven't seen anything else like it on the Game Boy. And to explain a bit about everything that you can see on the screen here, the bows on the bottom left represent your lives, and when it reaches 0, you're only sent back to the beginning of that stage, not all the way back to the start of the game. So it is quite forgiving, a lot more forgiving than some of the earlier Game Boy games for sure. The shields represent your life meter, and there's some items around the stage which you can pick up to replenish your HP as you go through the levels. The coins next to this are used just like Super Mario. You collect 100 to gain an extra life. At first I thought there might be a shop or something, considering this was quite prominently featured in the game, but no, it's literally just used to increase your lives and add to the score. And the final UI element that you can see here is your arrow types, shown in this square here, which you can then toggle between using the select button. There's actually several different arrow types, which keeps things interesting as you're playing through the game. Each of the main levels ends with a boss fight, and these range from interesting and challenging to complete pushovers, with no real difficulty progression between them. And without spoiling anything, the final boss is very different and actually uses a mechanic that's not explained anywhere else in the entire game. I actually struggled on it for about half an hour, and had to ask the developer in my stream to give me some tips and advice. So after you defeat one of the bosses in the levels, you're then given a power-up, and these are the different arrows that you can find. There's fire, ice, stone, and lightning. Each of these has their own uses, with some enemies only being weak to one type of arrow or the other. They can also be used to break down certain barriers, but outside of exiting the boss rooms, there's only a few times where this mechanic is actually used in the game itself. Onto the graphics next, and the graphics are quite nice. As you might have noticed, the game uses smaller sprites than most Game Boy games, which reminds me a lot of the simplicity of things like the original Super Mario Land and the original Batman game. I really love that style. It fits the system so well, and it actually allows you to see a good amount of the stage on screen at once too. The bosses use bigger sprites, which was a nice surprise, and it makes them stand out amongst many of the other smaller enemies in the game. There's also some nice full screen illustrations for when you speak to some of the characters in the game, and in between the stages too, and these look really good. Although the sprites and background tiles are quite small, there is a nice amount of detail, and the colour palette used on the Super Game Boy gives each level its own unique atmosphere. From the grey clouds in the sky, to the dark purple colours in the cemetery, to the light blue of the ice stage, it's a great use of the Super Game Boy, and it's really cool to see a homebrew developer take advantage of this specific way of playing Game Boy games. It was also a nice surprise entering one of the levels later on and actually seeing the Super Game Boy border change to reflect the different environment. In terms of controls, it all feels great. You can tell a great amount of effort was placed on making the character fun to control. The jump height is just right, and the arrow mechanics are fun to play around with. Some of the enemies in the game are a little bit frustrating though, such as these penguins in the ice stage, which charge at you, and you just get stuck on them with no way to escape as your health just whittles down to zero. There's no iframes at all, and I think that is something the developer should try and improve on in the sequel. Now onto the story, and this is where the game fell a little bit flat for me personally. The dialogue was very poorly written, with a lot of it just making no sense whatsoever. Luckily, the story is also explained in the instruction manual and on the back of the box, and it makes a little bit more sense there, so let me try and explain what this game's about. And by the way, I didn't get any of this from actually playing the game, but here's what the story's about. So basically, the moon is approaching Earth, and this has caused animals in the game to become intelligent and, for some reason, lock up humans in zoos. At the start of the game, your mum frees you, somehow she wasn't locked up in prison, and then it's up to you to rescue the other humans. To do that, you need to get certain amulets which allow you to enter a castle at the end of the stage. You get these amulets from fighting the bosses at the end of the levels, and then once you have got them all, you can enter the castle and confront the mad scientist. And at that point in the game, apparently, according to the instruction manual anyway, you're not sure as to whether he is planning to stop the moon from crashing into the Earth, or he's actually caused it to happen in the first place. So there you go, a very strange story that's not told very well in the game itself, but it doesn't really matter in the context of the game, it's still really fun to play. But it would have been nice if it was told just a little bit more coherently in the game itself. The music was definitely a highlight for me, with several really catchy tunes. I do feel like the game was lacking in the sound effects department though, with some very basic sounds and some things that didn't have any sound at all. For example, the lightning in this stage, where you're running through the clouds, could have had a thunder sound to accompany it. It would have gone a long way to add into the already great atmosphere of the stage. Interestingly, in the boss fights, there's no music whatsoever, which apparently, according to the developer, was a conscious decision to try and keep the player more engaged and focused on the actual fight more than what's going on around them, so I guess that kind of works. It definitely gave it its own unique style. The story behind the soundtrack is really interesting too, so on my podcast, the developer Studio Loading actually told me that the songs used in this game actually came from a band that it used to be in, and the band didn't have any vocals, so they were actually perfect to be transitioned into a video game. So he hired someone to take the existing music and translate it onto the Game Boy. And I think they did a fantastic job. They all sound really great, they make great use of the Game Boy's hardware, and they're just really catchy tunes too. I really enjoyed the soundtrack as a whole. So now we're going to take a look at the technical side of the game. The game doesn't really push the Game Boy to any new heights technically, but it's very competently programmed. It was made in ZGB, which is a C language library for making Game Boy games, and if you're interested in some of the technical details about how this C programming language works with ZGB, and the kind of stuff that went into the development of this, I definitely recommend checking out the podcast that I did with Studio Loading. I'll put a link in the description below if you'd like to go and listen to it. There are some limitations with the engine though, and I did encounter a few glitches and awkward moments where the player wouldn't quite move as I was expecting, or I would get stuck on some of the scenery or fall through the floor occasionally as well. And sometimes the arrow jumping mechanic didn't quite work as intended. It definitely didn't stop me having a fantastic time with the game though, and the main jumping and shooting mechanics felt fantastic for the most part. So I really can't complain too much about the technical aspects of the game. I think they did a fantastic job, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how they improve in the sequel. So in conclusion, Flying Arrows is a really fun and straightforward action platformer for the Game Boy. There are a few things that I think could be improved on, and hopefully we do see improvements in those aspects in the sequel, which like I said is actually up on Kickstarter right now. So if you want to help fund the development and get a physical version like I've got right here for the second game, check the link in the description and check out the Kickstarter before it's too late. And if you did enjoy this video and you want to see even more Game Boy Homebrew goodness, then check the video up there and check out my top 10 Game Boy Homebrew games so far. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, consider checking out Patreon to join everyone going up the screen right there, and I'll see you all again very soon for the next episode. Goodbye.